All right, wonderful. Well, I've got a minute past. Let's go ahead and dive in. Welcome everyone to today's webinar by Wall Street Prep. The goal of today's session is to sort of lay the groundwork with an AI-ready culture and discuss sort of driving into a successful transformation towards AI, as it's the relevant headline, I think, for all of us. So by way of agenda, what I look to cover over the next hour or so is how do we really think about an AI-ready culture first? What does that really mean in our organizations? I want to talk about overcoming organizational resistance. We're going to dive into that here with John and Huw shortly, and then by the end of it, kind of cover some how do we really align our cultural and AI strategies as an organization. So I'm super excited to dive in, and I want to introduce my colleagues here on the phone with us to help us guide us through this conversation. So first, I'm joined by Huw Richards, a former managing director at JP Morgan, where he led digital investment banking and previously ran global capital markets businesses. Before JP Morgan, he held senior roles at Credit Suisse, UBS, Lehman Brothers, and Huw has decades of experience transforming financial services through data, analytics, and now leads Bridge Insights, an AI advisory firm helping banks and fintech harness emerging tech in the real world. I'm also joined by John Riccardi. John Riccardi is a veteran investment banker turned innovation leader. John spent over a decade advising tech companies at Jefferies in the technology coverage group before launching and leading their firm-wide digital strategy. Before that, he worked in groups at Citigroup as well as Yahoo, and is now a senior instructor here at Wall Street Prep and an independent advisor helping companies build an AI-ready culture and scale productivity through sort of human-centric technology. So guys, I'm super excited to have you with us today. Excited to dive into sort of the content and the agenda that we have ahead. And Huw, I want to start with you. I want to allow you both to kind of represent your experience and what you've done at your respective firms. And Huw, our time overlapped together at JP Morgan. I was fascinated by some of the work that you were doing in building the digital investment bank, some of the automation I think that you were working on. And I think at that time too, which I want you to get into, is how we were using blockchain to execute capital markets transactions. And so as you dive in, Huw, and then John, I'll come back to you, maybe give some color as to your experience and what you were doing through your career, and then maybe give us a glimpse into what that environment and culture was like then as we bridge into how to think about it today.
Great, thank you, Andrew, and thanks for having me on the webinar, and thanks to everybody for taking the time to join. So the first thing I will admit is that I am certainly not a technologist, and I certainly have even though I've tried, I certainly have very sort of limited coding experience or anything of that background. What I do think I am is I'm a business person who is fascinated by the possibilities that technology brings to businesses of all shapes and sizes. So my narrative is, as you said, about 20 years in global capital markets. I loved the experience. It was incredibly rewarding working globally and building teams. But at the end of as again, Andrew, I think going back about that sort of 10-year period, as I was sitting looking at what was happening around me, right? What was happening in sales, what was happening in trading, what was happening in payments, what was happening in various parts of the bank, which was a great opportunity of working at a place like JP Morgan, right? You get a very broad perspective of what's going on in financial institutions. I was just fascinated by how people were leveraging data and analytics to enhance their businesses, and how it was really changing. It was really changing the composition. I mean, look over our careers, right? And you remember the hundreds, if not thousands, of people that used to work in cash equities, right? Now you look at it today, and it's the number of people working in it is absolutely de minimis, but the size of that business has increased exponentially, right? And it was experiences like that that sort of sticking my head up and looking around me. And I think one of the benefits was, to me, working on the trading floor, you saw this kind of like firsthand. And my philosophy was always like, look, if this is coming to investment banking, it's coming through my business first, right? So we started, and I say this in the most polite way, we started stealing money, right? We took tech budget and we kind of like said we were doing something with it and squirreled some other stuff away. And I had great tech partners that allowed me to do it. We started experimenting, right? And some of our experimenters worked, a lot of them failed. But what we did is we kind of took that experience and said, hey, let's see if this works. Let's see if we see what works, and let's see if we can scale this up across all of our investment banking businesses, capital markets, and advisory. The final thing that I'll say on this before turning it back over is, I approach this topic with a ton of humility. And I want to be just very clear is that, I have kind of failed more than I've succeeded. But I think one of the things that, I really want to point out here is that, this is obviously a transformation game, in a lot of places. I would also point out that, the returns around this, or the progress around this, is very unevenly distributed within financial services. If you talk to someone in payments, for example, they've already left this chat, right? They've moved on, right? This is a AI, machine learning, digitization. That's a given. But there are a lot of areas, which I think we're still focused on, where there are a lot of those kind of gains to be made. And what I'm hoping through participating in things like this is developing a dialogue and a language about how we can develop ways of being successful in implementing this. Because I certainly am not there, but I want to be part of helping develop those outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's super helpful, Huw, and I'm excited to kind of draw more on those experiences and try to understand more what that kind of felt like at that time as we kind of look towards developing that AI strategy. So John, how about for you, as you were sort of a technology coverage banker that had started to innovate at Jefferies, think about what a digital strategy really looked like. Shed some light on what that experience was like for you, and kind of what was the environment, the atmosphere, and what was the culture for you at that time?
Yeah, well, so my background is actually similar to Hugh's, but a little bit different in that I started as a software engineer in Silicon Valley and then became an investment banker afterwards. And in the late 2010s, definitely had observed the exact same phenomenon that Huw was describing. Was in other parts of the industry, and certainly among our clients in Silicon Valley that I was spending a lot of time with, technology adoption was much faster, and even the sort of classical AI stuff like machine learning and natural language processing that's been around for a while was really gaining a lot of traction. But in the investment bank, it was still the adoption was maybe less enthusiastic. I think one area where I was really lucky, sort of contrasting the JP Morgan experience, was that we did have executive sponsorship from day one. So I had made my thoughts known, in every forum I could about sort of what the potential was. And fortunately, at the very top of the firm, the CEO and the president saw that opportunity, and they funded this initiative, this digital innovation initiative, and I had the opportunity to lead that. But I will say that probably the most important thing that I learned was there's a real tendency to believe that the technology is going to just be magic, and that this is much more of a technology issue. And the truth is that it's a cultural issue, right? And I think it's important to remember that in all these functions, you've got people that are working long hours, even at senior levels, under enormous stress, and they've got their work habits, and bringing something new into their workflow is extraordinarily difficult. Even the most enthusiastic adopters, they would just forget about the new the new tools that we had built. And I think actually one of my colleagues is in the audience, who former colleagues who's now at a different firm, who I remember telling me a story about spending time with some of our bankers out in the field, who would say things like, "Oh yeah, I remember you guys had this thing that you launched at the all hands last year, and it did this really cool thing. Whatever happened to that?" And she would say, "Take out your phone, scroll over. It's that icon right there. It's been on your phone ever since January. It's in the same place. You just forget to use it." So I think that cultural reinforcement and that repetition is a really, really critical part of the recipe that is very easy to overlook.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So help me understand, I guess at that time, I think you said some interesting things. There was some executive sponsorship, leadership, the tone was sort of present. But then what did that mean for the rest of your peers, your colleagues? What is the kind of inevitable fear or anxiety here? I'm curious to hear how both of you would frame that, how you think about, as you try to create that cultural shift. What are the fears that we're all kind of thinking about as we implement as sort of an AI culture, an AI strategy, or data first strategy?
Well, I think you hit the biggest one, at least in investment banking, which is being embarrassed in front of a client. And, investment bankers have a tendency to really dig into all the analysis and every detail of what they're going to say before they walk into the meeting. And at some level, every AI tool becomes some kind of black box. And we do a lot of work around explainability, and we do our best to drill down to all the source data. But the reality is that you're dealing with much larger data sets, so it's just not something that a banker or a human being is going to be able to dig into and understand every single input the way they can with an Excel spreadsheet. And false positives are a real problem, and we will probably never get to a level of AI maturity where there are no false positives or where there are no errors or hallucinations. And there's a lot of risk aversion there, where people are saying, well, if I don't understand exactly how this number was calculated, exactly how this prediction was made, I'm not willing to stick my neck out and present that to a client. And I think getting over that hump and getting people confident that, hey, the AI is going to be right 95% of the time, 98% of the time, and sort of training them how to think about that and how to manage through that situation is really critical to at least getting investment bankers to actually use the results on a regular basis in their work.
Yeah, it's super helpful.
Sorry. Go.
Well, Huw, I want to kind of draw on your experience too and understand what it was like to kind of get the buy-in from your peers around you and kind of motivate the team and kind of what maybe the looming fear was at the time too. But John, I've got a story to tell. Maybe we'll circle back to later in the program. But Huw, yeah, please share kind of what was your experience like at JP Morgan and getting team buy-in?
Yeah, because John said a number of things that sort of resonated with me, but I think there are two things that I would add to that. The first of which John also talked about is, I was very lucky, like John, to have very senior sponsorship to have a shot at this. And again, I think that's like a key learning, for everyone. Someone has to sort of believe in you and sort of believe in the mission. And I was lucky to have people that did that. The other thing that at that time, right, is that we really focused on, we really wanted to try and transform or innovate from a position of strength. Things were going really well. And what we didn't want to do was try and innovate in a panic, right, where either competitors had caught us or we'd been blindsided by something, right? There was no sort of strategic imperative to change, right? Apart from looking to the future and saying, kind of what got us here might not keep us here, right? Which I think is a pretty, pretty key mantra that I've sort of internalized from that period. So again, our motivation back then was to try and innovate from a position of strength. Arguably, it might have been bleeding edge, and we can talk a little bit, more about that. But the second thing, John, sorry, Andrew, that I want to say as well is that one of the smartest people I know, when I took this job, said, your problem, Huw, is that you're basically a Rorschach test. Is that people are going to look at you and they're going to project all of their insecurities onto you. And I think one of the things that I've sort of learned from that, I wish I'd learned it more at the time, right, is that we have to have, as we engage on this transformation effort, we have to be able to try and figure out a way to have an honest conversation about what our fears are. Because John highlighted, a fear, right? One of the biggest fears, it was my fear as an investment banker, is a client's going to ask me a question I don't know, and the guy from Goldman Sachs is going to be able to answer that question, right? And I'm going to lose the deal, right? So that was my motivation, right? So you felt that you had to have everything sort of within your control, right? So yeah, that's a valid fear. And I think as technologists, right, we have to want to be technologists in my case. You have to sort of respect that, right? Other fears are like, quite candidly, okay, I'm going to lose my job. Okay, let's talk about that, right? Let's have a real conversation about that. Other fears that it's going to devalue me, right? It's going to devalue my experience that I have built up over 5, 10, 15, 20 years, right? And whenever this topic comes up, it doesn't matter what guise it comes up. That's a real fear that comes up. We had to forget about technology. We had a very similar conversation. I think a lot of people have very similar conversation. We talk about recruiting from non-core schools, right? Okay, that's going to devalue my experience. That's going to devalue my relationships with my alum, etc. Right? So these are very real things, and they have to be respected. And I think bringing them in a cultural way to the surface. And saying that, because there are real answers to those questions, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about, I don't think it's positioning, right? You don't want to position the answer or market yourself. You want to come up with sort of, really what the truth is in answering those, because you're only going to get it if people are afraid, right? You're going to get lip service, but you're not going to get real buy-in and real focus. But we have to have those conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I recently read an article from McKinsey, and in summary, it said that the majority of leaders are thinking about kind of AI fluency within their firms and within their teams to make sure that they're sort of ready. Given the fear that you just mentioned, the article also mentioned or took the stance that if you're not supporting your team to create AI fluency and data fluency and things like that, and you decide to kind of cut workforce, you will fall behind your competitors. Does that resonate with you? Does that kind of largely hold true? And then as a leader in an organization, how do you start to articulate that message and that vision for an AI focused culture?
So from my perspective, I think one of the big problems that I wouldn't say problem is the wrong word, but the narrative, right, that's out there is not a very encouraging one, right? Everyone's going to lose their job. Then don't worry about, don't just think it's coming for sort of, the people that just do administrative tasks. Pick a horror headline, 30% of white collar jobs eliminated and everyone's going to be living on universal basic income, right? It's not exactly the world's most exciting, argument to say, hey, let's get enthused about this. And also I think that's sort of just, it's kind of incorrect, right? I think the narrative, there's some truth in it, like there is in everything, right? But I think why I got into this game is for like a slightly different perspective, which is the amplification of human capability, right? And I genuinely, that's not just like a marketing line. I genuinely believe that. John and I talk about all the time. Investment banking is all about relationships, right? Dunbar's number, which has been around for a while, says that I can, in my head, hold 150 relationships, max, right? Okay, investment banking is a relationship game. What if I can expand Dunbar's number by a factor of 200, by 1,000, by 1 billion, right? That's the amplification that I think that I get truly excited about. And I think this sort of narrative about cost cutting and look at all these analysts rearranging slides on a page, it really begins to miss the woods for the trees, the forest for the trees, or whatever the expression is. And I really would like, as part of this narrative, I would like this narrative to be changed. My image that I always have around this, which again, I don't have any original thinking, by the way, I take this from smarter people than me. One of my colleagues, ex-colleagues now in private equity, he talks this all the time. He goes, I want to be Tony Stark, and I want you to build me an Iron Man suit. And I'm like, yes, that's what I want to do, right? And that's very different than the majority of the narratives that are out there. I think if we can start talking about those, then we can get people a lot more excited.
Yeah, I would echo that, and I think it was actually a challenge for me as a techno enthusiast, because I never felt the threat of, oh, there are going to be fewer, staff needed. I always kind of saw it through the lens of, this is going to be an amplification of human talent. And I still have this. I was actually having this conversation yesterday with a senior leader at an investment bank who, went in with the sort of standard idea of, oh, well, we'll be able to do this and this and this, and we won't need as many analysts. And what I say is, well, go look at investment banking before Excel, or in the early days of Lotus 1-2-3, when you had to go into a room to model and you had like a whole graphics department that, were the only ones that could create slides. It's true that the banks don't employ as many graphics specialists anymore, but as the analysts and the other bankers got more tools, what we saw was the expectations just kept rising, right? The expectation is that this person is going to be more productive. They're going to produce higher level thinking. They're going to be able to do more calculations, or in the case of AI, I think maybe do more research, maybe produce more detailed analyses. And that's where I see the industry going. And I think in a lot of knowledge work industries, you're going to see a lot of the same. And yeah, maybe we don't need analysts to spend 20 hours a week moving logos around slides. But if you think for 1 minute that an investment banking managing director is not going to look at that free time the analyst now has and say, hey, go do this targeting exercise and see if you can find me 10 new really interesting client prospects to target, or take this list of 20 existing clients that I need to deepen my relationship with and come up with interesting ideas or interesting perspectives to share with them, or help plan an interesting conference or event where I can bring them together and show them the value of my firm. If we think that's not going to happen, then I think we're not really paying attention to the way that the industry operates.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I enjoy some of the stories you were sharing. Just a quick one from me. A lot of the bankers that trained me on the healthcare team at JP Morgan would often refer to how banking used to be, or cut and paste used to be, scissors and a glue stick. And we've got shortcuts. We've got a lot of tools on our machines to help accelerate sort of our capabilities, our offering to our clients ultimately, and teams have only gotten bigger to offer more capabilities. And I kind of use that analogy as sort of how we're reacting and adopting a lot of the tools that we're using around data and AI. I had a question yeah, go ahead, Huw.
No, sorry, I was going to pick up on that, and because I think it's an important point. I agree with John that a lot of everyone talks about I think it's a little bit an overused phrase, and I don't necessarily like the connotation, right? That this is sort of an apprenticeship business, right? But I think what's happened is technology has actually had the impact of degrading the experience, because now your apprentice, quote unquote, is expected to be the chef, the cook, and the bottle washer, right? They are supposed to be able to turn V60 into V61 of a presentation like right away. That never, again, I did the thing where we went on planes and cut out letters and glued typos. I did that, right? So I know what you're talking about. And I think the biggest risk, and I think that, is that the adoption of AI, quote unquote, becomes just another move from Lotus 1-2-3 to Excel to, AI. And we're all still, kind of having this discussion. just kind of about less people. We haven't had any real impact on our human capabilities and our real strategic objectives. Not just can we turn things faster and push through more stuff that is quote unquote productive.
That's really helpful. So as we kind of shift the mindset to forward thinking, you've both worked on projects that have sort of maximized the potential and efficiency and kind of integrated data and technology into your commercial focus. How do you decide today where to focus your AI efforts and capabilities as an organization? How do you think about the next step to start to adopt AI from, I guess, a technical stance, but then also a cultural stance?
I think a lot of it depends on where you are, first of all, and what kind of flexibility your organization has. One thing that worked really well for us at Jefferies was that we were able to sort of section off the IT folks that were working on our AI initiatives, and they had their own processes, which were reviewed by our compliance department and so on and so forth. But they did allow them to move a lot more quickly and create a real culture of experimentation, right? Again, I think in financial services, the default mindset is we have to know that it's going to be perfect. Everything has to be fully tested 6 ways from Sunday, and then we're going to launch it, and it's going to be the solution until 2 years from now when we do the next upgrade. And in a world that's as dynamic as the AI world is, that just doesn't work, right? You need to be able to iterate much more quickly, and you need to have a culture that you mentioned earlier, and I would echo the sentiment as well, failed more than succeeded, right? You need to have a culture where you can say, okay, this quarter, here are our 10 experiments, and here are our success criteria for the experiments. We're going to dispassionately review them at the end of the quarter, and maybe 2 or 3 are going to succeed, maybe 6 are going to succeed, maybe none are going to succeed, and even if none succeed, next quarter we're going to move on to the next 10, and we're just going to keep doing this until we find the stuff that sticks. And we're also going to recognize that sitting here in July of 2025, we cannot tell you what we're going to be working on in January of 2026, because there's a good chance that some of it hasn't even been released yet, and it might be a product that is going to come from a company that was founded yesterday that we haven't even heard of.
Yeah, I think that Andrew, to add onto your question there, I think where I try and spend a little bit of focus is moving, and it's another way of saying, I think what John was saying, but how do you move technology from supporting the business to enabling the business in people's minds, right? And I think that's what you really, if you look at this sort of transformation that we're really talking about, and you look at, is technology, in my mind, me shouting at the IT guy because I can't log in the morning, right? Or is it a partnership by which I lay out my strategic objectives for me as a business leader, and how can technology help enable those, right? And I think this is where you get into like an interesting discussion about AI, right, and technology in general. Is you have to link the technology to its enablement of actual business outcomes. And so let me just be very sort of specific about that, right? Let's say, for example, okay, I want to move my market position in M&A sell sides from number 5 to number 3 in 2.5 years. Okay, what mix of humans and technology can help me achieve that strategic objective? And to say technology is going to do it all is absolutely ridiculous. To say most people's response today is to say, you know what I need to do? I need to go and hire 5 more sell side guys, right? Or people. Okay, well, let's just take a step back, right? And let's just say, what is the mix, right? What is my challenge in winning those mandates, right? Let's be specific about it. Is it better pitching? Is it meeting more clients? What is it of those? What makes me? What is the formula that's going to move me from 5 to 3? And how can I leverage technology to help me do that, right? And that becomes, and look, it may be efficiency. You know what I want to do is I want to reduce the amount of time that analysts spend moving PowerPoint charts around so that they can spend more time doing X, which will help support that, right? So my point is not that, you know, analyst efficiency and all that kind of stuff is a waste of time. It's more of a question about how are you going to redeploy that? If that's your objective, how are you going to redeploy that talent into what does achieve your strategic objectives? And I really think, you know, we now are lucky enough to have technology at our fingertips that it can actually help us do that, right? A shift from Lotus 123 to Excel it helps supporting our business a lot better, but it really, and maybe it enabled a little bit on the edges, right? But what it really does now, what we have now at our fingertips is a type of technology that can really enable us, right? And that's where I think you're going to get you know, the returns that you want to the necessary experimentation and failure and, you know, inevitable cost, quote unquote, of doing this.
100% agree. And this is the first conversation that I have with all my clients today, right? They often they want to start the conversation with, oh, we need AI, you know, which tools should we buy? And I always have to back them up to, well, what are your strategic goals? And in the way that your business operates today, how do you plan to accomplish those strategic goals? And it's in that conversation that we find the opportunities to say, all right, well, this is a problem where AI can accelerate. This is, you know, maybe a way to unlock a different path to that strategic goal that isn't currently available to you. And that's where the really exciting conversations start to happen.
Yeah, that's helpful. Maybe just to get one layer deeper or a little bit more specific on that thing. So Huw, great example, right? If you want to move from 5 to 3 in the league tables on a specific sell-side M&A, as you mentioned, what is the first step that a leader can make to start to use technology to influence that outcome, right? So I think there's a lot of folks here on the phone that would love to achieve that goal, and we're always striving to be better, right? And kind of move up the ranks, if you will. Commercially, what is the first and maybe second step a leader can make today on their team to bring technology into influencing that outcome?
So I think, and John and I laugh this, it's a rhetorical question. Maybe the audience recognizes it, and maybe the audience doesn't recognize it. So, and I'll never know, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. Does anyone remember the movie Office Space? You know, and you know, there's the guy who's like, I'm the people person, right? I talk to the engineers so that so that they don't have to talk to the people. I do think that there is a massive importance of accountability, right? And appointing, and not just sort of lip servicely appointing someone that's going to lead this, but making it someone's job, right? Who is a true domain expert. I think it is sort of wishful thinking right now to think that the brightest AI minds that we have, even within these organizations, are just going to sort of say, oh, I just took a quick look at the M&A process and I've kind of figured it out, and this is what you need to do. No, it's not going to work. I just don't believe it's going to work that way. I think there are a lot of people. Okay, I'll leave that editorial away. But I think there's this idea of partnership and accountability, right? Is absolutely critical. The second thing, and one of the great privileges that I think I had in working with investment banking and technology, working with teams of engineers and data scientists and various other things, is I had a totally different appreciation for the way in which other people run their businesses, right? And I think the idea of metrics and KPIs and OKRs and various other things that we don't really talk about a lot in investment banking. Go back to some storytelling, you'd have these sort of, I work with some absolutely fantastic engineers, and they're like, okay, well, what we're trying to understand is, when we're helping people do these things, how many points in JIRA does a senior investment banker assign to creating this point of a pitch book? And I'm like, I see why we have a little bit of a disconnect, right? That's all done via email, and it's kind of they're like, oh, okay, so So I'm sorry, wait, I don't quite understand. So how do you know how long something takes? How long do you know how something, how do you know how many, right? And I think one of it's sort of sometimes putting those sort of things together really help you. So this is a long way of saying, right, not just having accountability is important, but what is our outcome that we're striving for, and what are our benchmarks kind of along the way? And it's a little bit different than, and I personally, again, fortunate enough to work with technology leaders who gave me great stuff to read around this, highly influenced by John Doerr's book around Measure What Matters, and how they implemented OKR frameworks at Google. And it's very different than how we think about things in investment banking, right? We stake out a position, a strategic mission, and we set up a set of key results that we're going to track going there. And I think if you try and put those two things together, accountability and a framework that people understand about what my objectives are and how I'm going to mark progress against those, that's really how you begin to crack very complicated problems like this. Or else the default will be, let's just hire another 4 people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, to maybe double click a bit more on the M&A example specifically, Andrew, you asked a great question, right? Which is, so you want to move up in the league tables 2 spots, how do you get there? And the reality is that it's going to be different for every firm, right? When I was at Jefferies and talking to the head of M&A there, I'm talking about expanding that business versus Huw talking to the head of M&A at JP Morgan. The market that is, accessible and addressable to each of those firms is different based on their skills, their differentiated capabilities, their existing relationships. So, I think at that level, I would want to go deeper with the business and say, all right, well, is it geographic expansion? Is it covering new industries? Is it deepening in an existing industry? Is it more sponsor deals? Is it more public company deals? Because each of those pathways is going to have different business tactics that you're going to apply, right? And I think in our ideal sort of target state world where every business is AI enabled and every worker is thinking about how to use AI to enhance their work, once they identify the tactic, then they'll know, okay, for this tactic, these are AI tools that could be useful, or in fact, this is the prompt that I'm going to give to ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or whatever to help me identify AI tools that will advance this particular tactic. And I think that's really what we're going for is getting people to get into that mindset of, all right, once I'm down to the tactical level of this is the blocking and tackling I have to do, I now know how to use AI to give me leverage on those tactics. But it's business, it's got to be business strategy led if you really want to see an impact in the financial results of the firm.
Yeah, I can't emphasize. I mean, John, I think that's brilliant. That's a brilliant point. I think one of the things that is really important is that there's going to be no single playbook that works for everybody, right? Everybody has been dealt a different franchise. Everyone has a different franchise, and everyone's been dealt a different set of cards, right? And I think how you make this work within your specific culture, within your specific franchise, I think is a crucial point. But I think it's a great opportunity, right? Because I've hung around the hoop for a very long time. When I joined JP Morgan, or Chase, then JP Morgan, we were kind of like an also ran in capital markets, right? Particularly in the area I specialized in. And I
Funny.
know how,
Wow.
right? And I know how and Lehman Brothers was #1, right? Let's see how that ended. But we chased, I know how we got from 20 to 1, right? I know how we closed those gaps. And what was clear, what I referenced this at the beginning, is that what I also strongly believed is that what got us there wasn't going to keep us there. So I think that's a huge opportunity, right? But the second thing I also think that's incredible now, right, is if I'm not #1, right, if I'm #5 or #6 or #7, there are very different ways of closing those gaps that existed to you before, right? You won't have the same, you won't have the same set of cards or the same franchise as #1 or 2, for whatever, or else you'd be #1 or 2. The question is how can you leverage this technology or emerging technologies or differentiated technologies to change your competitive position and run a different playbook? It's no different than, let's go back to all sort of the classics, right, that have come out around this topic. It's no different than baseball and Moneyball, right? I've got a very different franchise, I've got a very different budget. How can I run a completely different playbook using technology, using data and analytics to close that gap, right? These examples, kind of all around us, and it's just a question of how we apply them to, our specific domains.
That's really helpful. I mean, I know there's a lot of folks on the line that probably have that commercial lens, commercial focus, and they're looking to kind of solve that as a business outcome. Shifting gears slightly just to a different persona, there's a lot of folks on the phone that kind of support new hire onboarding, talent management, really the lifeblood of these firms, the culture, the people as they're joining. As you think about AI readiness, what can those folks do today to kind of assess whether or not they're AI ready, assess whether it's kind of existing culture, but also assess and protect every new individual that's joining the firm to represent their brand, to ultimately be that career and culture carrier throughout, as they decide where they're kind of deploying their career efforts. Any advice or any thoughts on how those folks can start to perform sort of an internal assessment for if we're AI ready? And then what are the things that they should be thinking about? Huw, maybe I'll turn it to you, and then John, anything to add?
Again, I don't have a lot of answers, but I have a lot of things to sort of take a look at to help steer you towards some of those things, right? Because again, each of these, everyone's playing again a different recruiting game or a different development game depending on their franchise. But one of the things that deeply concerns me, or has always deeply concerned me, is when I looked at the skills and capabilities that incoming early career people had, and what we were able to provide them with once they got there, once they arrived, I would be a little bit, if I was in that position, I would be a little bit shook with sort of cognitive dissonance, right? Where it's like, wow, I think last I checked, 40 to sort of 50% of it, like an incoming class, and it will now be, a much larger number, has at least basic to intermediate engineering skills, right? They've been, and now Python is I think it's a requirement in almost every single major MBA program, right? And they would say, hey, come over to investment banking, all that stuff that you learned, forget it. You can't deploy it here. We're going to you remember Excel? You're our good buddy Excel, right? And I think there's a little bit of a cognitive dissonance that's sort of occurring that, that I think has to be a little bit resolved, right? In terms of what tools people are used to working with and what's available. And I think this is not new, right? This has been true for the past 20 years, right? We've always marveled every morning that, what technology is available to us at home, and then would go to the office, right? And we were still using fax machines, right? This isn't new information. I think the problem is, and this is the opportunity and the challenge, is that the ubiquity of ChatGPT and Perplexity and all these kind of things, it's really it's really put a very bright spotlight on us. So I think there's a talent, there's a risk here that you begin, unless you adapt to this, you're either not going to get the talent you want, or you're going to have a little bit of a challenge retaining that talent to people that are thinking about this a little bit differently. So a long way of saying is I think L&D and various other people have to be like really linked with the business in terms of talking about this, because it's going to be a big driver of their talent pipeline going forward.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think the talent war, is continuing to intensify. I remember when I got into investment banking, coming out of technology, investment banking still had, I think, a much clearer, stronger prestige level than the tech industry. And, I think we've seen something of a shift there. And I mean, I actually remember when I used to do a lot of analyst recruiting over the years, I saw a shift from, we're trying to get this candidate to come to Jefferies instead of Goldman Sachs, to, I'm trying to get this candidate to come to Jefferies instead of Google. And I think it's going to require a lot of persistence with those business leaders to really start to get them comfortable with new tools like Python and LLMs and everything else, so that the young talent sees the opportunity to do their best work at this job. I also think it's really important to engage with those senior business leaders to get them to reinforce what the staff learn in training, because I think the other thing you got to remember about the investment banking world is there's a ton of, we all have to go through these FINRA exams, and we have these annual compliance certifications and continuing ed, and a lot of people look at that as sort of a necessary evil, but not really something that they can get value out of. And I think a lot of senior people are sort of, they bring that mindset to sort of anything that's labeled as training or education. And I think really getting them to understand this is quite different. And in order to get the benefit out of it, we need the reinforcement from the senior business leaders that, hey, the stuff you're learning is really important, and we're going to use it. We may not immediately be using it every day. We may not be using it with every client and every deal, but we're going to find pockets in our group where we are willing to take a little bit more risk, do a little bit more experimentation, and get some proof points to see that, oh, well, here's a new way of doing something that actually should become our norm once we work out the kinks.
Yeah, I just want to make one more point on that, Andrew. The one thing I do want to say is that I have no doubt that for the foreseeable future, there will always be 1,000 applicants in every single investment banking position, right? So we're not talking about, oh my God, I'm going to have a hard time filling my analyst class, right? I think that is, you kind of take that off the table, right? That's not really what we're talking about. I think what in my mind, what we're talking about is, and again, I loved this job when I started, right? I thought it was like not just the most prestigious job, but I thought it was the most interesting job, right? I thought it was absolutely fascinating, right? What we were fortunate enough and privileged enough to have a front row seat to. And I think there's an opportunity, right, to sort of to redo that using this technology, right? I can strip away a lot of the stuff, right, that technology has made you has made it easier for you to perform and made you quote unquote more productive. But there's an opportunity to sort of hire into the most technologically enabled class, the most technology enabled firm, so that we can focus on building your real skills, right? The real apprentice, when people talk about apprentice skills, right? We can focus on building a real apprenticeship model of a focus on client coverage, client excellence, those types of things, right? Rather than defining excellence as there's no real like errors in this 250-page presentation, right? So I always come at this from, that it's really about, tremendous opportunity to recast this career and this back into being just as prestigious as working at a Google.
I think those are helpful takeaways. I mean, you're still guided by your North Stars and supporting your clients and seeking opportunity while also staying very closely connected to the business to make sure we understand the needs and kind of how can we support any new hire to be ready. So John, I want to circle back to that story I wanted to share and kind of get your response, get your input. And while I do that, I'll ask the audience to share any questions that you'd like to ask John and Huw here as we kind of round out the last segment. But so John, as you know, and as most of our audience knows, Wall Street Prep delivers new hire training to thousands of individuals around the world. And I've got the opportunity to observe some of those. And there's no denying that the AI fluency for the new hire classes today is high. As you think about circa spring of 2023, everybody was sort of using these tools through their final segments in university, and now they show up on the desk and they're ready to use them. They're there by default. They're loaded up as soon as they start their machine. So I was observing a class and I was kind of walking around. We were getting into precedent transactions and deal comps and all those analyses that you actually include in a fairness opinion or to perform relative valuation to support an M&A transaction. And I was sharing some resources that you would look to, how to read a merger proxy, how to identify those deals, how to select comparable transactions, all those things. And someone raised their hand and I sort of provided the microphone and said, please, what's your question? They kind of put the microphone down, insinuated they didn't want to broadcast the question and said, hey, why wouldn't we just put all this in ChatGPT? And I was kind of left not stunned. I think I anticipated that question, but perplexed by what my next response was going to be. And to a lot of your remarks throughout this conversation is, as a banker, you need to know the brass tacks. You need to prove it. You need the empirical truth of what it is that we're doing. You need to be able to defend it to a client. And so I think my response was kind of like that. But John, how do you, being a senior MD in the tech coverage group at Jefferies, and then sort of your digital influence, how do you respond to that individual? Kind of what's your reaction, and then any other thoughts that come to mind around that particular example?
Yeah, Andrew, I'm really glad that you're sharing that story because this is good. It helps me prepare for the inevitable day when I get the same question in the classroom. I think the response to that individual, to that new analyst, is, look, ChatGPT is a general purpose tool, and even with its, as a person who uses it very heavily, including the deep research feature, which I recommend to everybody here try if you haven't already, it is not able to process enough merger proxies. It's not good. It's not going to go to the depth that you need to go to really answer that question well. And then you layer onto that at every investment bank, in addition to the public information, you've got your own private databases that either that you've built proprietarily or that you subscribe to, whether it's PitchBook or Merger Market or FactSet or whatever. Part one to that analyst is ChatGPT is really smart, but it doesn't know enough about this to get this right. And then the other side of that coin is the conversation to have with the senior leaders at the firm, because if your firm has an enterprise ChatGPT subscription and you can load all of that information into a vector database or into context for your ChatGPT sandbox, then it would actually have that capability, but it's got to be something that is firm sanctioned and is actually augmented with all of the information that the analyst would actually look at. And I do. I think there is a world, and you see private equity firms are doing this much more effectively than investment banks, based on at least the conversations that I've had with people in both industries. And I think where we will get to is that most firms will ultimately have an assistant who, an AI assistant or agent that has all that data, can give you a good list of comps and links to specific sources for all of the information so that it can be cross-checked by a human being for accuracy. So, I think the answer to the analyst is you're not going to get the right answer because it doesn't know. And then the message back to the seniors is you need to be marching towards a world where you have, whether it's GPT or Anthropic or whatever provider, where you do have that capability, because your competitors are going to have it. And again, in the private equity world, they've adopted it much more aggressively. I talk to people at large private equity firms where they do have these amazing internal libraries that are with a ChatGPT front end, where they can ask a question like, find me 15 deals that have these characteristics, and 10 minutes later you get a detailed report with links to specific sources, and they rely on them every single day because they work really well.
Yeah, it's helpful. Huw, I'm curious if any responses to that analyst. I really look to you guys for advice and thoughts on that. Any response for?
I would obviously echo John's comments, entirely. But I think what it does point out, right, is a big part of this transformation is kind of this sort of data culture, right? I think every senior business leader has to look at what data drives their decision making, and then really understand and drive a strategy towards where is that data, right? Who owns it? Is it accessible? Is it verified? Is it secure? Is it locked down, et cetera, right? Because then once you have that data culture, right, I think there's this sort of little lack of understanding, which comes back to fundamental education. The sort of AI is this thing that sort of wanders around the 28th floor and kind of says, oh, look, that's a comp, that's kind of cool. Look, that's another comp over there, right? If you look at what AI really is, right, it starts with data, right? It doesn't just magically make this stuff up, right? So one of the things is you have to say, what is my core business data? What is the data that drives all of my decision making? And is that data AI ready, right? This is what when we talk about AI readiness, right? Is the core, to make my AI any good, is what is the inputs? What's it working with, right? And if you have to start with one place and it's boring, trust me, it's really boring and it's really hard work. But once you do it, the gains to it are exponential. It's 80% of the lift, but the fun stuff is 20%. So if I had to leave one message for people on that, is like, it's this real focus on data, and that's going to be your gateway to getting AI where you want it to be.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate the input. As we're advising a lot of our clients here at Wall Street Prep just in how to develop their AI roadmaps and what it means for their firms and for their team cultures, I think that truth still holds, right? Which is, you still need to understand the trade. You need to understand the ins and outs of every bits of it. You need to do, not going to say, it's kind of my rule of thumb, which is you need to do 20 to 30% of the upfront work and understanding how you're going to interact with this tool to create leverage for yourself. And then you've got to do all the finish work, the bring down work, the completion work, the scrutiny, all the layers that come on top of that to really finish that, to get you from that 80% to 100%. So kind of to our earlier remarks, it's an accelerant that I think is very important framing, as I mentioned, is kind of how we're crafting or supporting our clients and thinking about the roadmap. You still need to understand the trade. You still need to make sure you understand the ins and outs, and really just start to think about how you interplay with these tools and how to create leverage from these tools. Well, guys, we are at the hour. I just want to take a minute to say thanks so much for joining. Thanks to all of our audience for joining and jumping into this conversation. Incredibly insightful. I've got several takeaways just in how to think about how we interact with AI, what it means for our teams, and how to start to think about an AI culture in our organizations. Our goal at Wall Street Prep, and really through this session and the broader programs that we're delivering and that we've developed with the Columbia Business School, is really to give professionals across finance and business a clear understanding of how AI is actually being used today, right? And how to think critically about where it fits into your team and your organization. So, we're not trying to turn anyone into data scientists overnight, as I think the two individuals here on this call have a claim not to be. But we do believe that decision makers need to be able to speak the language, sort of ask the right questions, and guide their teams in using these tools to become more integrated in the way that they work. So if anyone here is thinking about how to develop that roadmap and thinking about how to build that capability inside of your function, whether it's leadership training, team workshops, or something a bit more customized, feel free to reach out. Please do. I encourage you to reach out to Wall Street Prep at aisolutions@wallstreetprep.com or to your dedicated account manager. And let's continue the conversation with myself, with our team, with the others here on the phone, both John and Huw, to see how we can kind of create that roadmap and create that solution for you. So again, just want to thank everyone for joining. John and Huw, fantastic. I really appreciate all your insights and input here on today's call, and look forward to the next one.
Terrific. Thank you for the time. Appreciate it.